Good afternoon and warmly welcome to this webinar on the future of globalization. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at the trade union related think tank called Arenagruppen. And within Arenagruppen, I'm responsible for the Productivity Commission, which has globalization as one of its main themes. Our main guest today is no less than Pol Antràs. He's a professor of economics at Harvard University and specialized in international economics and applied theory. In particular, he has in recent years done a lot of research on the global value chains and their consequences. Among other things, Professor Antràs is the editor of Quarterly Journal of Economics, the world's most prestigious economic journal. Mr. Antràs, very, very honored to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm delighted.
With us today, we also have two very distinguished guests, Lena Sellgren, who is the chief economist at Business Sweden and also part of the independent group of economists advising and supporting the social partners within the manufacturing sector, Industrins ekonomiska råd. With us today also Fredrik Sjöholm, who is the CEO and professor of at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm, also specialized in globalization, trade, foreign direct investment, and issues related to East Asia. Also very welcome to you. The setup today is very simple. First, we have the presentation of Mr. Antràs for 50 to 55 minutes. Then we open up for a discussion among the three guests, and we also take some questions from the audience. So please state your sharp and short questions on Facebook, and we will address them later on. All in all, we have 90 minutes at our disposal. So having said this, Mr. Antràs, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I look forward to comments, questions, and discussion. I'm also particularly delighted to see Fredrik here, whom I'm not sure I've met in person, but I definitely know his work, and I've admired him for some time now. All right, so let me get started by telling you what I plan on doing in the next 45 to 50 minutes. So I want to first tell you a bit broadly about global value chains. Try to, as Daniel was saying, some of my recent work is on this specific aspect of globalization. So I want to try to explain to you why is it that I spend the better part of my time thinking about this type of activity. And then I'm not going to dig very deep on that. Obviously, this is not the forum to kind of go into the technical details of some of my research, but having given you a broad picture of why it's important to understand global value chains, I'm going to apply some of these insights to think about a much more tangible question, which is the issue of deglobalization. As you might have heard or read, there's a lot of talk out there. There's many commentators that are implying that we might be entering or might have entered a new phase in history where we might be deglobalizing at a rapid pace. So I'm going to first study this empirically. What do we know about this? Is this true? Has it happened? And if it has happened, how has it happened? And after doing that, or in the process of doing that, I'm also going to discuss briefly, but I think it's important to discuss how that interacts with the recent COVID crisis, and obviously also how it's interacting with the more recent geopolitical crisis and with Russia and Ukraine. And then I'm going to leverage these insights, both conceptual aspects that I'll start with, together with the empirical facts that I'm going to summarize, to provide some speculative thoughts on the future of globalization. Okay. And in doing so, what I'm going to do is, after reviewing very broadly some of the lines of my research, I'm going to tackle this issue of deglobalization by structuring the rest of my presentation into 10 points. Okay, I'm going to try to get 10 points across. And these points and other points are laid out a bit more carefully and are more detailed in a background paper that is available from my website, which is on the topic of deglobalization. All right, so let's start with the topic of global value chains. What is it? What is this about, and why is this important? So let me start with some examples. Okay, and the background perhaps here is a backlash or a reaction to how folks in international economics research had thought about international trade flows or globalization. To a large extent, the work emphasized the decision of firms to not just remain local, but maybe export in foreign markets. So lots of the canonical frameworks, including your countryman Olin, who won the Nobel Prize for some of his work on trade theory, emphasize this idea of specialization or exporting. But if I look at trade flows today, they're not so much about, France exporting cheese and, Portugal exporting wine and the sort of classical examples of consumer goods being flown across countries. Modern trade flows, to a large extent, reflect parts or segments of what we call global value chains. An example of that would be in the country where I live, the US. We have a big aircraft maker, Boeing, who is often portrayed as an all-American company, like a prototype of an American company that is competing in world markets with Airbus, which is a European company. And there's lots of debates about the extent to which maybe there should be subsidies to Boeing so that they can, maybe compete on more equal grounds with other Airbus, which might be receiving subsidies from Europe. But all this discussion, it seems to portray Boeing sort of as an American company that produces aircraft in the US and exports them worldwide. And part of it is true, right? These aircrafts are indeed assembled in the northwest part of the US. But that production process is much more complex. It's much more complex because in producing this aircraft, as you see in this picture, Boeing is actually using parts and components that are coming from all over the globe. Okay, they're coming from Japan, they're coming from Korea. There's some parts, the cargo access doors, the picture indicates, are actually coming from Sweden. Okay, so this reflects, as I'll say in a second, a broader phenomenon, which is even though we still exchange goods that are being consumed by consumers or services that are consumed by consumers, in producing these goods, firms now tend to embody parts and components, or more broadly, what we call in economics, value added, that is originating in many, many countries. Now, in thinking about the use of foreign parts and components or foreign value added in production, obviously, if you want to try to make sense of this at a conceptual level, you're going to have to take an abstract view of what this firms do or what these global value chains are all about. This is what we do in economics. It's very different than, say, the field of management, for instance, or international business, which might, in some cases, might be much more focused in understanding exactly why is Boeing doing what it's doing? Why is it buying this particular thing from this country? And that's absolutely essential. And in many cases, we learn a lot by going to a very detailed case. What I do is economics research, where we step back a bit and maybe we're going to think conceptually about why Boeing and other companies might be doing what they're doing, but we're not going to be writing down models that are going to be tailored to specific companies. So when I look at Boeing and when I look at this as a sort of as a theorist, if you will, I think about spiders. You might say, why is he thinking about spiders? Well, I think about spiders in the sense that one way to conceptualize this production process at an abstract level is basically thinking about it as sort of a spider. The spider is going to have a core, and then it's going to have some legs that come to the core. And I think about the legs that come to the core as the parts and components that are coming to the core. The core is the assembly plant. The assembly plant is in the US, is in a country, but these legs are not short legs. They're not legs that are around the assembly plant in the US. They're very long legs, and they're going all the way to Sweden, all the way to Korea, all the way to Japan. So through this conceptualization, the rise of global value chains would be a phenomenon under which firms, instead of being spiders with short legs, with suppliers around your factory, they now have longer legs, and they're using parts and components from suppliers that may be located very far. And they're embodying those parts and components into their products. A second example is what I call a snake. And what I'm plotting here is the example of the production of a microchip. This is an industry, we could spend a whole session talking about semiconductors. It's obviously a very, very relevant topic these days. I want to emphasize something much more narrow about this production process here, which is, unlike the spider that I started with, this is a production process that has a very natural sequentiality. Okay, so what are chips produced with? Silicon. It's not just any silicon. You need to take the silicon and you need to go through a process of purification. You need the silicon to be super pure for the chips to work well. So this silicon purification is a production process that out of it comes out a cylinder of pure silicon that then it's cut into discs, very, very thin discs. We call those wafers. And then we go through wafer fabrication. This is the core of the industry. This is where the innovation really was, where the Nobel Prizes were given, and this and that, where it's a process where you're basically printing the transistors and all the connections in those wafers. But that's not it, the end of it. These wafers are fairly large. Okay, there's no way you could fit that wafer into your cell phone. There's a last stage of production, which is called chip assembly, which is basically taking these wafers, cutting them into small chips, okay, small parts, and then packaging them and sending them to the end users, which are going to be the electronics industry, or in this day and age, just about any industry. That's why semiconductors are so important. What I'm emphasizing here is not per se the production of the microchip, but the issue that this is a production process for which there is a natural sequence of stages that need to be performed in a predetermined order. So it's like a snake moving, in a sort of a precise directional way. And through this conceptualization, we would think about global value chains as a lengthening of the snakes. Maybe the snakes, they were always snakes. One of my favorite movies of all time is Modern Times. Maybe you've seen that movie, Charlie Chaplin. It's black and white. Those that are young will never have heard about it, but those that are a bit older like me might have remember that movie. And there was this very famous scene with an assembly line, and they're kind of banging on stuff. So this is an assembly line, okay? What we're saying is that this assembly line is now being geographically fragmented. This snake, this line is becoming longer and longer. It's now crossing borders. So the snakes are actually crossing borders. And again, this is one example, but we could think about many production processes that have this natural sequentiality. The world is more complicated, right? So obviously, we have things that look like spiders. We have things that look like snakes. But even you could have told me, look, even if I look at the spider, it's not quite right, because you're treating all these parts and components that come into the factory as sort of a unit. But, there was a production process, when the cargo access doors are produced in Linköping. I don't know how to pronounce this. In Sweden, there was a process to produce these things. And maybe that process was a sequential process. Maybe I want to think about spiders, but the legs of the spiders not being legs, or being snakes. So it's a spider with legs that are snakes. Or maybe I want to think about a snake, but each of the nodes of the snake, the wafer fabrication, the silicon, all these things are using many things. There's like legs that are converging at every node of the snakes. It's a snake with like legs coming out of different nodes, okay? And I know this is a little bit uncomfortable to think visually about these things, but the point I'm making obviously is the world is a world of snipers. There's a combinations of those things. But maybe it's worthwhile to think about them separately and then think about how they You can think about them jointly and sort of use this abstract conceptual frameworks to try to tease out, what are the forces that might have led to this fragmentation? Where are firms deciding to fragment? Where are the snakes extending to? Where are the legs going to? What are the factors that are generating this fragmentation? Now, I've given you 3 examples. This last one I didn't mention is just the auto industry, where it's very clear there's assembly plants, but each of the parts that goes into a car obviously goes through a process that very often is sequential in nature. I want to next just briefly illustrate that this is not just abstraction or theorizing coming out of 2 or 3 examples that are particularly suited to rationalizing one way to think about things. Or more broadly, that this notion that we are less and less in a world where, as in David Ricardo, we're exchanging wine for cloth, and we're in a world where we're exchanging stabilizers for chassis, for engines, for like all these parts and components. And that we're in a world where the decision of where to produce is actually a non-trivial decision, even if a firm is originated or headquartered in a country. So one way to illustrate this, again, based on the country where I live, but I'm sure that for Sweden, the numbers would not be dramatically different, which is, suppose that I try to figure out how the US as a country, or the firms in the US, how do they make their products available to foreign consumers? So what do I mean by a US product? It would be a Boeing airplane. It would be a Ford Fiesta. I would say the Ford Fiesta is an American good in the sense that it's branded. It's a product that originated in a US branded company, Ford. Ford is an American company. Now, there's basically 3 ways in which those US goods could be made available to foreign consumers. One is the traditional mode that David Ricardo and Heckscher and Olin and all this sort of famous trade economists discuss, which is the notion of exporting. If a US firm like Ford produces cars that are demanded abroad, they might find it profitable to not just sell locally, but sell to these foreign consumers. That will entail some cost. You go into unfamiliar environments. But if there's demand out there, you might serve it by exporting. That's the traditional mode. But in the modern economy, as you see in this figure, this is only about 1/4 of the sales of US branded goods. So if I think about Ford and about many other US companies, Coca-Cola, I mean, you name it, like the classical, the big US companies, by a large, the vast majority of their sales are actually coming from foreign production. You've got the blue segment here. This would be Ford, for instance, producing the Ford Fiesta in Valencia, in Spain, which is where they have an assembly plant, and selling those cars in Valencia or in Spain more broadly. These are what we call local sales of foreign affiliates. This is a US company that sets up an affiliate in a country, produces in the country, sells in the country. That's very large, as you see. There's a big chunk of sales of US branded products. And then there's a third aspect, which entails exports, but it's exports that are very different from traditional exports. So this would be, in the case of Ford, this would be the same Valencia plant producing Ford Fiestas, but not selling them in Spain, but actually selling them in, say, Portugal or France or Germany or Sweden. Okay, so it's an export from Spain to those countries, but it's an export of a US branded product. Okay, so that suggests that the way companies think about what they produce, who demands these things, and how they make their goods available to foreign consumers is very, very different today than it was at the time when folks develop the traditional theories of trade that are still quite dominant in my field. So I'm calling for a new sort of way to think about things and hopefully embracing a bit more the complexities of the modern economy. Another systematic way to demonstrate this is based on the US. You might have some qualms, maybe the US is just special in this direction. There's a body of work in recent years that has tried to more systematically study the extent to which the use of foreign parts and components, or the use of foreign value added in the production of goods that are then exported, which is one way to think about global value chains, is try to document to what extent is that actually going up or systematically increasing. So this figure shows you evidence of this. I'm plotting on the y-axis what we call the domestic value added embodied in world exports. So aggregating across countries, to what extent when countries export, those exported goods embody just value added in the country that it's exporting them. This would be, suppose you are growing potatoes in a country using local fertilizers, using local labor. This would be 100% local value added. Back in 1970, the world didn't look like that. That is, firms were already using some percentage, somewhere like between 12% or so of foreign value-added exports. But you see that this share has declined a lot in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I'll come back to that in a second. But this is a period of very fast globalization. And the way this globalization, the way it took is basically by a fragmentation of production, where more and more firms were using foreign value added, and therefore the domestic value added share fell in producing goods for exports. Okay, so that's basically as a mode of motivation. I know I've spent some time on that, but I think it's important to understand why why we care about global value chains. But let me sort of more take stock and tell you precisely what are the questions that motivate a lot of my research, which is, does it matter that about 2/3 of world trade is in intermediate inputs in these parts and components rather than in final consumer goods? Okay. Does it matter that we often, when we write down models of trade, that we might then take to the data, that we might then use for quantitative analysis to guide the potential scenarios that might arise from Brexit or from a regional trade agreement, whatever it may be? A lot of the models we're using, they actually don't necessarily take that into account. When they, another aspect that they often don't take into account is that the trade relationships that are established, when one models how they're established, we often think about the exporting firm setting up those links. So modern trade theory often emphasizes that in venturing out to foreign markets, exporters need to kind of incur investments in trying to find suitable buyers for their goods, setting up distribution networks, this and that. And lots of the results that come out of this modern trade theory are tightly related to what we call the selection into exporting. If you follow the examples I gave you before, I look at those examples, and more than selection into exporting, I very often see selection into importing. I see big companies like Boeing, like Ford, like Intel maybe, that are spending a lot of resources trying to find suitable sellers for the things they need. It's not the suppliers that are knocking on these big factories or big companies' names, the doors, and sort of asking to sell to them. It may happen, but very often these big companies have massive procurement departments. They're spending a lot of resources trying to figure out who are the right suppliers for their parts. And it's not obvious to me, and it hasn't been obvious to me for some time, that ignoring this is actually immaterial for what you learn from abstracting or theorizing about trade flows. Another thing that we typically ignore is the sequential nature of production, the fact that we often have these snakes where there's a natural sequentiality. Maybe some of the implications of trade liberalization, of regional trade agreements might be affected by the sequentiality. Maybe it matters where in value chains do you contribute value. If you're very upstream or you're very downstream, does that matter? Where do you want to be? You want to move up the value chain? You want to move down? It's very hard to make sense of all these things that I think people in policy and maybe in business care about, but we often don't sort of think hard when we do economics research. In a nutshell, I've been sort of asking myself and trying to convince people that perhaps we do need new models. Now, this is the point in which maybe I would dig a little bit deeper into these models. I'm not going to do that. Let me just, I'll come back to this in a second. Let me just tell you in a nutshell, if you're curious and you kind of can Google my website, if you're curious to dig a little bit deeper, I'm just putting here 3 recent papers where I've been trying to kind of make some progress on that. Sort of, I have a initial paper where we modeled spiders. We modeled the operations of US companies through the lens of spiders. And we disciplined the model with very detailed firm level information on customs data and operational data of the universe of US firms. So we saw what they produce, where they produce, if they imported parts and components, if the legs of their spiders were long enough to kind of lead to imports, if they were importing, what were they importing, where they were importing from. And we basically designed a model to try to understand these decisions, and then used that model to think about what the implications of trade with China were for the US, and emphasize some differences that arise when you think about US imports as the legs of spiders rather than exports of finished products, which is how we typically think about what the US imports and traditional models. I have another paper thinking about sequentiality, snakes. It's work with a former student of mine, De Gortari. And then more recently, I've been working on models that combine this, snakes and spiders, and on the data front, use the same data I had used, the US Census, US Customs, but merged with multinational data, detailed multinational data, the foreign operations of US firms, which is the basis of the graph I showed you before, where we knew how much US companies are selling abroad through local sales or third market sales. I believe, I think that similar data exists for Sweden. I might have seen some work using that Swedish data. So that's basically what I'm doing, trying to have frameworks that some of you would look at them and feel that are a bit too abstract. And they're arguably abstract because they're not like tailored to particular industries, but sort of emphasizing the richness that arises when you sort of take this new view, which I think is a more satisfactory view of international trade, and emphasizing the novel insights that emerge. And I think part of to come back to this, part of the reason why I think, and by thinking so, I sleep a little bit better at night. I think it is particularly important these days because other than trying to provide tools to think about a complex world and try to reduce complexity and try to better understand with a big brush why firms do what they do, there's now a lot of demand to try to understand scenarios. We're in a world of trade wars. Trade war initiated by President Trump, but we're still in the midst of a trade war in the U.S. with China. We are now in the midst of a geopolitical crisis with Russia. There's the potential of escalation if China were to invade Taiwan. There's a lot of demand to figure out if this happens, where will the world go? Okay, so that, we can make predictions based on gut feelings, okay, and that's one way to go, and that's what a lot of commentators often do. But we now have tools to do a bit better based on an better understanding of the world, based on statistical analysis with available data. We can make better predictions for what things that might happen. If we want to understand the China shock, the fact that U.S. imports from China increased dramatically in the 90s and 2000s, and we want to understand to what extent the decline in manufacturing jobs in the U.S. was tied to this versus, say, technological change. We have better models to think about that. If you want to understand whether trade wars are going to bring back jobs to the U.S. or they might actually backfire, we have better tools to think about that. And I don't have the time to go through this, but a lot of what I've been emphasizing in my recent work is that if you made prediction based on state-of-the-art models that ignore global value chains, you'd often get predictions that are wrong, that would be somewhat misleading about how we expect things to react to trade liberalization or to tariff wars in this more recent case. Anyway, I could, I think you're kind of getting the sense that I could go on and tell you about my research, but I want to now switch gears and touch upon something quite different, but building on what I've been telling you about, which is there's been a lot of debate about the future of globalization. I think there's a general consensus that global value chains are very much at the center of this question. And I want to try to tell you about how I view this debate and help you outline possible scenarios that where we might end up in the next few years. And I'm going to do that around 10 points. I have maybe about 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to be a bit brief, but happy to dig in any of these issues later in the Q&A. The few points I want to make are purely empirical, and I don't think they're controversial, but let me put them up first. So the first point is that I don't like talk about deglobalization, or let me put it better. I do not believe the world has or is deglobalizing as of today. Okay, if I look at the data, I find very little evidence indicating that we've already entered a phase of deglobalization. What do I base that on? On a variety of facts, but let me focus on one. If I plot the ratio of world trade, exports and imports, or an average of them, over world GDP, this is a ratio that some people look at these numbers and they say, look, since the great financial crisis, this share has been going down. And because this is typically a measure of globalization, we say this is indication that the world is deglobalizing. Okay? So I'll make points around this figure, but the first point I want to make, which people often don't appreciate, is that this is all driven by China. Okay? So if I were to compute the same ratio, excluding China, I can net out China from both trade and GDP, we see that this is basically flat. There's much less evidence of a decline. Now you might say, well, this is because, decoupling. This is what we're talking about. There's going to be a decoupling with China, but not quite, because this is all happening well before tariff wars. This is happening well before any talk about decoupling. What is this driven by? This is actually just driven by the fact that China, in this period, moved up their value chains. They used to be much more a pure assembler of goods. They would import parts and components from Korea, Japan, the US, etc., put them together and export them. And in recent years, they've been moving upstream and they've been capturing segments upstream from assembly. Is that because they're deglobalizing or because they're putting barriers or anything like that? No, it's purely technological progress. They're getting better at more things. And we can debate why and technological expropriation, a lot of stuff that was behind the tariff wars. But this is technological change. This is not deglobalization. Okay, this is a sign of Chinese success. It's not a sign of deglobalization. So that's the first point. I don't see much evidence of a decline in measures of globalization. That's one, but I've looked at many other measures. The second point I want to make, let me skip that, is that globalization was inevitable. That is, the fact that the ratio of world trade over world GDP was going to stabilize. This was inevitable. This is a series. This is an economic series that I wouldn't expect it to grow all the time, right? This is not inflation or the price level, or this is not GDP. We expect these variables to grow over time as long as we continue to, there's technological progress, or as long as we keep printing money, prices will rise, GDP will rise. The ratio of world trade to world GDP is a very different animal. This is something that at some level it's capped. It cannot grow arbitrarily. So in my view, it was inevitable that this was going to happen at some point. That at some point, the ratio of the measures of globalization could not continue to rise forever. And in my view, what's really extraordinary and what really requires a lot of careful thinking is this period, the prior period. I don't know if you see I don't know if you see my mouse moving. Hopefully you do. I think you do. This period from the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s up to the great financial crisis. This is extraordinary. We have a rise of the ratio of world trade to world GDP from a little over 15% to it's almost a doubling of that ratio. That's what we call the process of hyperglobalization. So I think it's very fruitful to think about what happened here and then ask oneself, why did these forces stop operating in 2008? What drove this and why did it stop working? Why didn't it continue growing? And perhaps more importantly, could these same forces start working in reverse so that we might be entering a true phase of deglobalization? Okay. So my point 3 is about emphasizing the prior period. What explains this massive growth earlier? In a nutshell, 3 forces are key. Technology, and more notably the ICT revolution. Policy, most notably regional trade liberalization and the entry of China into the WTO. And 3, politics, namely, most notably, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberalization in China and India, but particularly China. Why are these keys? Why are these key things? Well, if there's some business folks in the call, you'd appreciate that in a world without fast internet, in a world with much less powerful computers, it would have been very hard for companies to be able to operate, communicate, coordinate at very long distances. Modern technology was absolutely essential for the growth of the legs of the spiders, the lengthening of snakes. It's absolutely key. It basically allowed to produce at far distances. Policy, trade liberalization, that was essential too, because as I mentioned before, if we live in a world where there's going to be all these flows of components, parts, components, you saw the semiconductors are going back and forth. It's a mess. There's a lot of flow of goods in these global value chains. Any reduction in the cost of these flows, initially containers, but also through man-made trade barriers, reductions in tariffs, those are going to be really good for this process. Okay, so we saw a very dramatic decline in tariffs in many cases that led to increased profitability of global value chains. And the third factor is this politics, which is all of a sudden, and let me just zoom in, in Europe, obviously, Eastern Europe is essential. Berlin Wall falls, you've got Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. These are countries with very skilled workers at very low wages. It's very appealing to fragment production in those places. China is another example. Hundreds of millions of individuals that were working in a different economic system, all of a sudden they entered the capitalist system. Okay, so that was a big shock and led to a dramatic reorganization of production that manifested itself, among other ways, in this very dramatic increase of globalization. So let's then structure the next few points on precisely these 3 forces. If technology drove hyperglobalization, why did it stop operating, and might it work in reverse? If policy, trade liberalization fostered this, why is it not happening anymore, and might it start working in reverse? And politics. If China opened up and generated all this stuff, Hungary opened up, what's going to be happening? Are these guys maybe actually going to close, and we're going to lose that third leg of hyperglobalization? So let's tackle each of these things, and I'm going to start with technology. And my view here, and I don't think that is uncontroversial, but I'm going to try to be a bit controversial. I'm big on technology continuing to foster trade. I believe that historically, just about any technical innovation we've seen in the last 3 centuries has tended to foster globalization. When I look at digital technologies, when I look at blockchain, these are new technologies that, in my view, totally favor increased trade integration. They reduce transaction costs. They reduce search costs. It's easier to find partners far away. It's easier to monitor. There's rating systems. There's lots of things that actually reduce the cost of operating at long distances. Folks that take a different view and they tell me, no, you're wrong, technology will come back. The new forms of technology are very different and they're going to reduce globalization. Largely what they have in mind is automation or industrial robots, these things I had in this figure here, or in some cases 3D printing, but this is still very small. Okay, so robots are much more relevant. The argument goes, firms in the West, they went to less developed economies searching for lower wages. They wanted cheaper labor. Now we have robots, so there's no need to do that. We can stay in the North. American companies don't need to go abroad. They can produce in the US. And yes, wages are higher, but they can use robots. So that seems like a well-put argument, right? And there's maybe some truth to it. I take a different view, both based on conceptual aspects, but also based on evidence. The conceptual aspect is that if I think about automation and I see what's being automated, I see things that look like this. I see robots having automated the assembly of cars. And more broadly, lots of the uses of automation of robots are really in assembly, in very limited set of production stages. So we are not yet in a world where robots can do anything that humans can do. We may get there at some point, okay? And if you invite me in 80 years, I might give you a different pitch, because maybe in 80 years, robots are going to look very different. But as of today, robots are especially good at assembling stuff. But they still need the stuff to assemble. They're not producing things out of thin air. They need parts and components. And to a large extent, what automation has done has been to increase productivity of firms. Obviously, I'm not seeking to diminish the labor market implications of automation. I know who I'm speaking to today, and there's many aspects of automation that we could touch upon, and I know it's had dramatic impacts on certain types of workers. But from the point of view of firms, they've become much more productive. Car makers have been able to scale up. If they scale up, they're going to be asking for more engines. They're going to be asking for more tires. They're going to be asking for more chassis. That's going to increase the demand for parts and components. And to the extent that those are still coming from abroad, the forces of specialization are still operating, we're still going to see a very significant amount of trade flows. Okay, so I'm pretty optimistic that technology will continue to foster trade. Empirically, that's actually what we see in the data. There's a bunch of recent studies that have shown that firms that have gone through automation, they have not reduced their exposure to trade. They've actually started to import even more than before automation, reflecting the increases in productivity that often come with automation. So that's the case of automation here, and these are some of the empirical studies that have pointed this out. Let me make another point, which is also about technology. Okay, but it's not so much about technological change, but rather about the technological value chains. And that's something that I've tried to kind of incorporate in some of the work that I've done myself, which is global value chains are often set up in industries where there's very large scale economies. These are industries where setting up production plants, setting up distribution networks, setting up supplier networks involves very large costs. Okay, these are high initial fixed cost industries. The car industry is an example, semiconductors, etc. In addition, this fixed costs that were incurred whenever those networks or those global value chains were set up, they're very often what we call sunk in nature. Okay, in economics, we call a fixed cost being sunk when once we've incurred it, we cannot recoup it. That's very different from paying a big chunk of money for a house. Okay, that's a fixed initial investment, but then if you sell the house, you get the money back, maybe with some appreciation. In economics, there's often investments that are maybe because they're very specific to what you do, or because of their nature, some of the investments might be incurring lots of expenditures to try to screen suppliers or sort of business trips trying to find suitable suppliers. If you set up that network and then you break the network, you don't get those investments back. You incur them and they're gone. So we know from economics that the sunk nature of investments is actually very important for how firms react to shocks. Even though wages in China have gone up, even though we might be in the midst of a trade war with China, US companies are going to be very reluctant to pull out of China. They're going to be reluctant because they know that when they leave China, they're going to have to re-optimize their value chains. And that's going to entail lots of costs. Only when the firms perceive shocks that are A, large, and B, persistent, and that's a key word, persistent, will they want to pull out of China. So when we talk about deglobalizing and global value chains retrenching, I am absolutely sure, and I know for a fact, there's a lot of talk about it. If you look at recent earnings calls, it's everywhere. Everybody's talking about reshoring, diversifying, this and that. But when firms start crunching numbers, they realize that this is going to be very costly. So unless they become convinced that the ongoing geopolitical tensions between the US and China, or in other cases, firms that might have investments in Eastern Europe and might be concerned about the Russia-Ukraine situation, only when we perceive that this might be persistent shocks are we going to start seeing dramatic changes in the geography of production. So I'm going to come back to this in a second, because I think that's absolutely a key consideration when we think about how geopolitics are going to reshape global value chains in the next few months. Okay, so how am I doing on time? Okay, I still have about 5 minutes, so let me move on to the 5 last points. So a couple of this I can go quickly. Moving on from technology to policy, right? I told you policy, trade liberalization was essential for the growth of global value chains. Are we going to see continuing liberalization? No, we are much more worried about this. There are 3 particularly worrisome developments narrowly on trade liberalization. The first one, the WTO is in big trouble. Okay, the Doha round, which is the last round of negotiation, has been going on for over 20 years. Okay, so it seems like the WTO is not making any progress in pushing forward the multilateral agenda. What about the regional trade liberalization agenda? Again, some regional trade agreements are still being signed here and there, but we're starting to see not just the stalling, but we are actually seeing some retrenchment. Brexit is a notable example. Brexit is a step away from regional trade liberalization. In the US, the new NAFTA, the USMCA, is, some people call it NAFTA 0.8. That is, it's basically a NAFTA light. It's a lighter version, a bit more protectionist version of NAFTA. So again, regional trade liberalization is not making progress, seems to be going backwards. And obviously, the US-China trade war was a big shock to the trade policy world. And it's still, this was not just Trump, it's still on. And that's exactly what I want to emphasize next, which is my point 7, which is it's very tempting to point fingers and said, Brexit was a weird thing. Gordon Brown called a referendum. That was a massive mistake. That was a fluke thing. US-China trade war, this was Trump. He was very idiosyncratic, and without Trump, we wouldn't have had that. I don't think that's the right or most productive way to think about that. I think there's deeper reasons why we're seeing this. The reason we're seeing this is because these politicians, Gordon Brown, Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban in Hungary, all these folks were elected. They were elected because in society, there was a growing discontent with globalization. There was a rising backlash against globalization. And when politicians stood up and said, we are not so keen on this force, they reacted positively to those messages and they voted for anti-globalizers. Why did that happen? My reading of the literature is that there's many causes of this, but to a large extent is because of inequality. Particularly in the US, we see that Trump got votes in lots of areas that were very negatively impacted by trade with China. That folks in those areas, they lost jobs, they had a hard time finding new jobs, economic outcomes were very negative, and they saw that this was partly due to China, and they listened to Trump and they bought its message. So inequality is important, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. That is, even if I were to be positive or optimistic about the future of globalization, and I were to be optimistic about automation giving globalization a second win, or if I was high on digital technologies or blockchain giving globalization a second win, I think that all these forces would continue to be inducing inequality. Automation, as I mentioned before, increases productivity, might be good for firms, but some workers will lose their jobs. And it's going to lead to increased positive outcomes for people that are starting with good outcomes to begin with, and worse outcomes for people that start with worse outcomes to begin with. So unless we do something to deal with inequality, be it better redistribution, not in Sweden. Sweden has a very good redistribution system, but I'm thinking about the US. If we don't do a better job redistributing income, redistributing wealth, if we don't do a better job with active labor market policies, which are basically inexistent in the US, we are going to have to we're going to continue having backlash. So we're not going to go back to a trade liberalizing environment anytime soon. 2 points on COVID, and then I'll spend a minute on geopolitics. COVID, when I talked about this, I used to spend more time on this because it was very much on the agenda. COVID is still with us, don't get me wrong, but it's clear that it hasn't impacted things as much as people imagine. Initially, when I first wrote about this in September 2020, there was still a lot of talk, and we had witnessed a very dramatic decline in measures of globalization, of trade flows around the first few months of 2020. But things recovered very quickly. Okay, so yes, COVID looked like the world was going to end, globalization was going to end, but it didn't. And we had a very fast recovery. There's still talks about COVID leading to deglobalization. Okay, this talk is an example. It's probably hard to envision that I would have done this remotely. I would have probably been in Sweden and talking to you folks if COVID hadn't happened and we hadn't realized that there was these technologies to do this remotely. And you know, they're not a perfect substitute for interacting in person, but you know, they allow us to do things and get some benefits from globalization without moving around. So, you know, I think that's one lesson from that. But, you know, back in the day, a few months ago, a couple of years ago, people were saying we cannot be without face-to-face interaction. So if COVID leads to scarring effects and people don't want to travel anymore because they're worried about it, you know, the future pandemics or something like that, global on a decline because we're going to be traveling less. And my view was different. On the one hand, as I've just said, we have virtual interactions have become much more efficient. And if we continue to invest in them, I'm sure they're going to become even more efficient. And second, because we've gone back to travel. You know, I'm traveling maybe not as much as I did 2 years ago, but we're back to travel, and we're still worried about the pandemic, but we've moved on. So I don't think that COVID per se will be deglobalizing. The one factor that worries me, you know, in terms of global supply chains, the same is true. Of course, firms were facing lots of supply chain issues. We've talked about this, lots of distortions. They're thinking about, you know, maybe diversifying, moving closer. But again, I told you before, this is per se, COVID is not going to lead to big changes unless people think that this is a permanent shock. And I don't think anybody believes that COVID, at least the dramatic aspects of COVID that we witnessed in 2020, those are not coming back, at least not anytime soon. So I don't think that COVID per se will lead to deglobalization. It may be problematic because of inequality, because it might increase inequality. That's one aspect of COVID that really worries me, that there's going to be, we're walking out of this with lots of people being even more, feeling more alienated than before. But more importantly, we're walking out of COVID, and this is going to be my last point, and happy to elaborate more on that in the Q&A. We're walking out from COVID with a very delicate geopolitical situation. Leaving aside Russia, Ukraine, which I'm going to come back to in a second, my reading from this side of the Atlantic is that geopolitics in Europe, in Western Europe, are much trickier than they used to be. There were a lot of diplomatic tensions, a lot of tensions at the EU trying to pass this sort of bills to kind of help out people. There's a lot of, in the US, a lot of finger pointing. Relationship between US and China, which were bad already with a trade war, they're much, much worse. And again, because inequality has increased a lot with COVID, it's generated a lot of inequalities, and we haven't seen the end of this. I mean, I'm really deeply worried about effects on schooling, and moving forward, we're going to walk out of this crisis with a higher share of people that are, unless we do something, are going to be demanding protectionism. Okay, that's my reading of this. And now, in addition, we have a geopolitical situation, which is not just the tensions or trade wars, okay? But we actually have wars, okay? We entered a phase where Russia invaded Ukraine. There's lots of, you know, the probability that China might invade Taiwan is perhaps higher than it was a year or 2 years ago. And lots of people are worried about where that's going to end. Again, so happy to dig deeper on that in the Q&A, but I guess I'm a little bit I'm pessimistic about this. I should admit that, but I'm less pessimistic than others. And I'm less pessimistic than others for two reasons. First, because if I look at the Russian economy, to a first order, it looks to me like a gas station. I think I might have a picture of this. China is important for gas oil, and that's generated a lot of problems in Europe, and many people worried about the winter that's coming, and I'm sympathetic to that. But in terms of what I think about, or what I do in terms of global value chains, and particularly global value chains in manufacturing, they are not all that important. I understand that there's some industries that use oil or gas that might be affected by this, but this is not a shock that I think would be as important as, for instance, China decoupling. China is much more embedded in global value chains. So in my view, Russia is basically largely shot itself in the foot from an economic point of view. From a military point of view, human lives, I mean, we could talk a lot about that, and it's very dramatic what's happening. But from an economic point of view, this is basically Russia killing its economic prospects in the next 20, 30 years. I'm much more worried about China, as I said a second ago. But, I've been encouraged, actually, by witnessing China's reaction to recent geopolitical conflicts. They could have taken this as an opportunity to go wild in Taiwan. They could have taken a stance that would have been much closer to Russia, and they didn't. They've taken a much more pragmatic view, which tells me that perhaps they're a bit more committed to making globalization work than most people give them credit for. I know I'm out of time, so let me just conclude and tell you, broadly speaking, the 10 points that are basically saying, I don't think it's obvious that we're deglobalizing. If anything, we're slowalizing. It's hard to conclude that technological developments or COVID are likely to fuel an era of deglobalization, at least per se. I'm much more worried. I think the main challenge to the future of globalization is likely to be institutional and geopolitical in nature. I think that's what people want to know. And I think, the next talk, it's great that you guys are economists to talk about the future of globalization. I believe that geopolitics is going to be the main thing that's going to be relevant moving forward, and figuring out exactly what China is going to be doing in the next few years is absolutely essential for understanding the future of globalization. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
For your very clear and insightful presentation. Now it's time to leave the floor to Fredrik and Lena. And I start with Lena. What are your general thoughts? Can you give us a second, a minute or two to respond to Pol Antràs' presentation?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for a very insightful presentation, very interesting to listen in. I may have a slightly different view on the phase of globalization that we are into right now. And it could be interesting to hear from your perspective, Antràs, how you see this. Because if you look at trade in goods, we have more of a regionalized trade already since some years ago. And it has expanded a lot, the trade within industrial goods, in particular in the Asian region. And at the same time, we are just in the beginning when it comes to trade in services, as I see it. So we will probably see more of globalization going forward in services. But I truly understand that it's a question of standards, of course. There are risks for trade in services. But that's one question that I have. How do you see this? If you divide into graphs, the nice ones that you showed us, if you divide it into trade in goods and services, what is your view on this? So I see more of a balanced trade going forward. And a second comment from my side is also it's encouraging to hear that you are optimistic and more optimistic or less pessimistic, that you explained it more than others going forward when it comes to trade. I'm a bit worried that we may end up in a situation, if it will escalate, the conflict, the underlying conflict between the US and China, the technology race between these two superpowers. If we end up in a situation where we have two blocks, one Western bloc led by a democratic one, led by the US, and an Eastern one led by China, maybe jointly with Russia, we don't know at the moment, but China, authoritarian bloc with other values. The World Trade Organization recently calculated or estimated how this could affect the global economy, and their calculations suggest that if we end up in 2 different blocks, we will have a global GDP that will be approximately 5% lower in the longer run. That's their calculation. I have not been deep diving into the calculations, but that's also something that is interesting to hear a little bit about. And also maybe the regionalization that I started off with, how you see this when it comes to production. Multinational companies are more or less present today in the 3 production regions: North America, Europe, and the Asian Pacific region. And again, I think it's important to mention that trade within the regions, and in particular the Asian Pacific region, in industrial goods has actually since 1990 until now increased from 25 to 50%. So we are more having some kind of level playing field. So that's my reflections.
Many thanks for that, Lena. Your sound was a little bit problematic, so I don't know if all of us heard everything. But we continue with Fredrik, and then we go back to Pol. Fredrik, your turn.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Arena-gruppen, for organizing this important seminar. And thank you, Pol. I'm a big fan of Pol's work, and it's really great to listen when he shares his deep insights into the global economy and its development. Let me just reflect a little bit on what has been said. And it's clear that I think it's clear that we, at least on the policy side, are entering a new era where protectionism is on the rise. I mean, as Pol mentioned, we have the trade wars launched by President Trump, mainly towards China, but not only, also to Europe, and tariffs on goods from many countries in the world. It's important to notice that most of this is still in place. So President Biden has not really changed his policies more than on the margin. And we have the same development in other parts of the world. China, which we have discussed, they have the policy, I think they call it the dual circulation or something like that. They had a policy of Made in China 2025. All of these policies are really focused on being less dependent on the surrounding world. So that's, self-sufficiency, that's protectionism. And in the European Union, we have a similar development. There's a lot of talk now in the European Union on strategic autonomy, I think they call it, which really is, selective industrial policy where governments or the European Union should pick certain industries and certain firms and try to foster them into being world champions. It's interesting is that, of course, the French have always kind of liked this type of policies, but you hear very similar kind of lines of reasoning from Germany now. So Europe is definitely going in that direction. So why? And I think it's really, it's very, very interesting when Pol discussed the new technologies and so forth, because globalization is really driven by 2 things, I think. It's the technology, is it possible to move goods and services across borders? And then it's the, shall we call it, the political will. Do we want to integrate with the rest of the world? And when it comes to technology, I think, as Pol describes, most of the development is really kind of positive for globalization. And in particularly now, the latest development in digitalization and so forth is opening up totally new sectors for international trade, especially in the service industry. So you can have a person sitting in Rio de Janeiro, with a camera, and it feels like he's in your office in Stockholm or Boston. You can have translation programs. So I could give this speak in Swedish, and Pol with a couple of headphones would hear it in English or Spanish or Catalan or whatever language of choice. So it's really opening up all these different new businesses for globalization. So the technology positive. Interesting here is that what's happening on technology is largely outside of control of governments. Okay, so this might balance any development taking part on the political side, because on the political side we have seen more protectionism, and that is because of the distributional effects of international trade, as Pol said. We know that from at least the days of Heckscher and Wulin, that international trade is good for the whole world. It's, at least in practice, not necessarily in theory, but in practice, it's good for all individual countries. But within countries, there are winners and losers. And the one who had lost now in the western part of the world are people in manufacturing sector that see their jobs being moved to Poland or to Mexico, and perhaps in particular to China. And these people have, organized themselves politically. And there are very convincing studies showing that in US, for instance, the China shock has led to political polarization. It has led to the election of President Trump. There's equally convincing studies on Brexit showing that the China shock made people vote for Brexit. Although the Brexit was not really about trade with China, but that had a huge impact. Can one do something about this? And here I might be more positive than Paul, because it is true that this leads to inequality, but I think you can have systems that compensate the losers, taking some of the gains from globalization and compensate the losers. And it's interesting, I think, is that we are talking about widening inequality. That is very much the case in US, but not, for instance, if you see a country like Sweden. If you look at inequality as measured by Gini coefficients and so forth, nothing has happened in the last 10 years. If you look at absolute poverty levels, it has, I think, gone down by 50% or something like that in Sweden in the last 10 years. So you don't see that happening here. And this, despite, of course, Sweden has had maybe 1 million people from outside the European Union moving here with, relatively compared to the people who are living here, low skills. So I think it is possible to do something like that. And I should say, in most of continental Europe is the same. You don't see this widening in inequality. So what is needed? Well, you need to have some type of social security system. You need to have, unemployment benefits. So people that lost their job when it's moved to China can survive. And then you need to have systems that help these people by training, by education, to get jobs in booming industries. So I think it is possible to use some of the gains from globalization and compensate the losers. But maybe we get back to in more detail to this later. I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. For you, Paul, if you go back to Lena, the discussion on the possibility of service trade growth in the future, what do you think?
Good. Yes. So I definitely, if you want, Daniel, I can react to that, and I can very quickly react to the other comments.
Yeah,
I agree a lot with, but I might sort of say a little bit about it on services. Yes, you were Lena, you were breaking up a little bit when you were talking about it, but I understood you were saying, what are the patterns with service trade, and what are your views on the future? So many things we could say about. I mean, there's the obvious things about service trade has not recovered anywhere near as much as manufacturing trade after COVID, but obviously that has a lot to do with COVID being much more of a relevant shock for service trade. Think about tourism and things like that. It's not quite where it was. More in terms of the medium to long run future. And I think Fredrik was also talking about this. I think it's going to be on the rise, and there's at least two reasons for that. The first one is tradability. If service trade is not as large, I mean, we not always measure it well, but if to the extent that we measure it roughly accurately, it's becoming more and more tradable. There's more and more things that we realize, and this is an example of this, right? I don't know the value of it, but in principle, this is an export. What I'm providing is an export from the US to Sweden, technically. I don't think it's going to be recorded anywhere, but there are things that are now doable that they were not before. So that's going to make it more tradable. There's a second aspect, which I think we often miss, which is absolutely essential, which is that services as a percentage of economic activity have been rising and will continue to rise, because of relative productivity, because of an increase in income. I always say that 80% of what I'm going to spend my money on in 40 years, if I'm still around, is things that I cannot describe because they don't exist yet. Okay, it's sort of, we are innovating and creating new things, but they're mostly services, and who knows, but I would imagine a lot of these things are going to be traded, entertainment, leisure, and things like that. So totally, I always tell my students, you should work on services, and because that's there's a lot of interesting stuff there. You talked about blocks, and then you talked about regionalism, and that touched a bit upon issues that Fredrik was talking about. I am worried about the blocks, right? The two blocks put out a number of a 5% loss of GDP based on that. I think that's crazy optimistic. Okay, so I'm as pessimistic as others on reaching that scenario. But if we end up in that scenario, I think the numbers that come out of those scenarios are crazy low, crazy low. Okay, and we can get into that, but I could map it to what I started with today, which is the quantitative models that we use do not properly reflect just how intertwined is economic activity worldwide and how disruptive closing China or decoupling of China would be. And regionalism, yes, for sure. There's still a lot of, Richard Baldwin always talks about, the global value chains. They're neither global nor value, no change. And he says the global studies, they're mostly regional. There's a big regional component. There's no doubt about it, but they're still very much globally connected. Okay, so let me make the following point, which also touches on something Fredrik said, which is, yes, there's Asia factory, right? Asia factory, China is very intertwined with Taiwan, obviously, but Japan, Korea, but also Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But would that mean that if China decouples or Asia decouples, the U.S. would not be affected? No, that's not quite right, because the U.S. has a lag in many of this value chain. Okay, maybe things spend a lot of time in Asia, they create a lot of trade in Asia. But if there's decoupling and that part of the world does not have access to demand for electronics in the US, or the US demand for electronics doesn't have access to supply of electronics in Asia, that would be a big, big shock. Okay, so there is a lot of regionalism, but there's still, I do think things are much more global than basic trade statistics would say. Two more quick points. China, yes. Will China decouple or not? I said, I think they're being pragmatic, but I do believe that the self-sufficiency point, I think that was your language, Fredrik. If they reach a point where they think they are self-sufficient, and by self-sufficient meaning that they believe that Southeast Asia and maybe parts of Africa are sufficient for them, they might go that way. Okay, and I think I'm not a Trump voter or anything like that. But I do believe the U.S. and the rest of the world has been very naive in dealing with China in the last 30 years, 20 years. I think in the U.S., they thought this is like Japan in the 50s and 60s. We want them to develop, create links. But this is a good thing for us. They followed the same path. They looked away when there was technological expropriation, when there was foreign direct investment there. And now we're starting to see that, China is not Japan. In terms of size, it is much more ambitious militarily than other countries. It is a very different animal. I think a lot of people a lot of what Trump said was crazy, but a lot of what he said was actually not that crazy. The last point on redistribution, Fredrik, it can be done. Yes, I know it can be done. Sweden did it. Denmark did it. Many countries in Europe did it. But for this to happen, we need it to happen in also larger economies that, with all due respect, might have a bit more weight in like resuscitating institutions like the WTO, right? If we want the WTO to be powerful again, it has to have the backing of US, Great Britain, Brazil, China, and so on. And I'm just, I was just last week at a conference in San Antonio in Texas. And I put up this point about labor market policies and better redistribution. And it was not pretty. They were not very keen on that. Okay, this is Texas, this is Republican territory. They're saying labor market policies, they would never work in this country. So I think they're wrong. But it's gonna be it. You cannot. And I said, but look at Scandinavian countries. And they're like, well, it's sort of they can do it. It's not obvious that it's as doable as I wish they did, but I'm a little bit less clear that that's can happen easily.
Many thanks for that, Paul. Mr. Antràs, I have two prepared questions I want to ask you to elaborate, because sure. I think the viewers are interested in those. And the first question is, in a world with snakes and spiders and snipers, how should countries and politicians and trade unions think about competitiveness and productivity in this new world? And the second question is, how do you think about the climate crisis within this world of global value chains? So how to think about productivity and how to think about the climate crisis. Thank you.
Great. These are absolutely central questions. And I can give you some answers. They're not going to be definitive answers, especially on the second one. I'm really not an expert on environmental economics, but on the competitive productivity, when some people say, and I think that's true, is if you think about the global economy, the way that I've tried to kind of describe it, and I think about industrial policy as sort of policies that are going to try to help one's country's industries to become more competitive, to be able to compete better in world markets, and to kind of gain comparative advantage or specialize in some activities. Mm-hmm. The new paradigm that arises from this is one where instead of, say, becoming good at producing cars or sort of gaining a foot in the auto industry, which is how import substitution. Think about Brazil in the 60s and 70s, and more the 70s than the 60s, putting in place tariffs to try to have the emergence of an auto industry, of electronics industry, this and that. Countries don't need to do that anymore, because with the fragmentation of production, they now realize that even without being able to produce a car from basics to finished product, they can get a foot on certain segments of value chains. Okay, so it may be the case that a country, by its size or because of its resources, they couldn't do everything themselves. They couldn't be competitive, but they could maybe develop capabilities that would allow them to become particularly good suppliers of some parts of those cars. And I think we're seeing that, right? I mean, Eastern Europe developed a lot by becoming essentially assemblers, but then moved up the chain, much as I was talking about with China. But there's probably not a lot of car engines that are produced in Eastern Europe. And that's sort of an opportunity to benefit from specialization without requiring perhaps the scale or the broad range of capabilities that modern industries in this day and age require. So that's an opportunity. And, I'll say, coming back to Lena's question about services, it's actually a good opportunity for some countries in some continents, like South America or Africa, where physical infrastructure might be problematic, part of it because of lack of investments, part of it because of geography. But digital infrastructure is not so bad, it's easier to invest in digital infrastructure. Those countries can get a foot on value chains and services, for instance. Okay, so I say examples of Bolivia or Paraguay that are landlocked countries, hard to get stuff in and out, but they speak a language that millions of people speak, so that they could specialize in some things and services that for Spanish-speaking countries. So that's all opportunities. At the same time, obviously, this new model of globalization, the recent crisis has shown that it makes you more subject to shocks, in the sense that you not only face standard demand shocks, demand for your goods dries out in a country, or supply shocks, something happens at home and you can't find workers, or something. It exposes to supply shocks worldwide. There's an earthquake in Japan, 2011, and next thing you know, you can't produce cars in the US. So that's the trade-off where there's the issue of diversification that perhaps you want to keep in mind when you think about competitiveness and productivity. Anyway, that's a couple of things. We could talk much more about that. On the environment, a climate crisis. So here's why I'm not a Trump voter. I do think we're in the midst of a climate crisis. I've thought and read a lot about to what extent I've been concerned about what I'm doing on a daily basis. How much does it interact with this crisis? And my reading of the work that I've seen done is that there's less of an interaction that one might have thought. For instance, there's environmental costs associated with transporting goods. Okay, this idea that we shouldn't reshore because of China or because of risks or anything like that. We shouldn't reshore because there's too much back and forth of stuff, and that's generating emissions, and that's bad. Okay, and we should. So absolutely, I'm all for carbon taxes or cap and trade. I mean, all this stuff we need to regulate. There's no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's evidence that there's a crazy amount of emissions coming out of that. And in addition, it's also well established that a clean air is what we call in economics a normal good. That is the demand for which grows with it. And, if you go to China, we went to China in the past, it's like very smoky, it's a lot of pollution. But it's a country that has grown dramatically. It's become much richer now than it was a few years ago. And the demand for clean air in that country is dramatically higher now than it was in the day. So I would not be pushing for environmental reasons. I would not necessarily be pushing for protectionism. Because if we make countries poorer or we don't let countries grow as they should be growing and benefiting from globalization, the demand for clean air might actually be lower than the desirable level. I'm very worried about the climate crisis, and you could take the stance that, look, we need immediate action now, and anything that reduces emissions, we need to do it now. And if that's your view, and that's what science says, then it calls for extreme reactions right now. But if we have some time to react, I'm a little bit less clear that in that path towards clean air, the path would require bringing stuff back home, because there's going to be unintended consequences that might actually be worse than the benefits of doing that.
Thank you. Lena and Fredrik, what are your comments on the productivity issue? How do we should think about productivity and climate change from a Swedish perspective? Where are we and where should we be?
Well, I agree with what Paul said, that I think globalization has the advantage of increasing productivity by specialization, that you specialize in the parts of the production process that you are particularly good at. When it comes to climate, it is more tricky. I mean, it's clear that if we're going to solve this climate change, we need to have India and China on board. I think we have done some progress in parts of the world, but it's not going to be successful if we can't convince these giant countries to make some pretty dramatic policy changes. There are things, as Paul said, happening already, and that should be encouraged. Whether we should use tariffs, as we do in European Union, or discussing to do in European Union on polluting goods, I don't have a strong opinion. I think it's tricky. I can see both sides of that. I don't have a strong opinion.
Okay, Lena, your turn.
I hope you can hear me better now. Yes, I would just like to emphasize that we did a very interesting survey. We interviewed recently Swedish companies having production in Sweden. They can, of course, be foreign owned, but manufacturing in Sweden. And we asked them how they have changed the last 3 years, their supply networks, and how they plan to change them the coming 3 years. And of course, as we expected, Swedish companies have increased the number of SAP suppliers. And what was very interesting is that a bit more than 20% actually have already decreased their sourcing from China to the Swedish manufacturing. It doesn't mean that they leave China, but they have decreased the sourcing from China. And the ones that have increased, they have increased in particular in Central Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. And if we look 3 years ahead, 40% or a bit more actually say that they will decrease sourcing from China and increase in particular in Central Eastern Europe. And what they mentioned when we also asked what is important when you choose your sub-suppliers, more than 80% actually answered that the impact on climate and environment is the most important. And the second one is the distance from Sweden. So I wanted just to bring this. It's a survey that we did. We interviewed the Swedish companies. It's only a Swedish view. But if you have some reflections on this, because it shows, as we see it, also an increased regionalization of their supply networks. And what's your view when you hear this?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to, you know, you should send me the link.
Yeah, let me send you the link. I can maybe send it into
the magnitude, you know, I'm not surprised. I'm sure companies are, I'm not saying, you know, yeah. I hope it was clear. I'm not saying this is not happening. No companies moving back. There is happening. I'm just saying in the data I've seen so far, it's not large enough to be systematically showing up in the data.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it might be happening in some countries more than others. It may be happening in Sweden. I think, but by the way, I mean, I think it's absolutely fantastic that if companies are reshoring because they've crunched numbers or given their sort of corporate responsibilities or whatever they might be in their mind, they're deciding that the profit maximizing thing or the value maximizing thing for them to do is to come back. I think there's two ways to deglobalize. One of them is the one you're describing, which is more natural, which is maybe China is not as cheap as it used to be. Maybe we can substitute for labor better than we did before. Maybe we are more, we are either committed or face more pressure to abide by environmental demands. And we make that transition. And if firms did that, I think we would slowly converge to this environment, which might not lead to a very drastic or disruptive change to the global economy. I'm more worried about decoupling, or more worried about drastic measures that say, you know, you cannot do that there because A, B, or C. That's likely to generate a transition that is going to be much more painful for people involved. But I'm not, you know, I'm neither surprised nor worried about what you're describing. I think that's sort of natural, and I'm just curious to know how big it is. That's the main thing.
And the logic is probably the same when you go out to other regions as well. So it's not just a Swedish case as we see it, but we haven't done this survey yet.
Yes.
Fredrik, Lena, and Paul, the time is running out. So we have to close down. So I wonder just if you in 2 sentences can say how to sum up this 90 minutes, lessons, ideas, how go forward. 2 sentences, please.
2 sentences. Well, I think that the 2 sentences I'd say is, I think at this point, geopolitics are absolutely the central aspect for assessing the future of globalization in the next 10 years. And I would reiterate my encouragement to bringing us political scientists with an expertise on Russia or China, especially China, to help you figure out exactly where they see things going.
Thank you. Lena?
Okay, you asked me as well. No, I agree. I think that we need to, going forward, I think Paul started off with is that we really try to understand what's going on globally and put together scenarios, and not least the companies, management teams, they need to understand what's going on. How can my company be affected? So I should say work with scenarios, try to understand the geopolitical tensions as good as possible.
Thank you. Fredrik, finally.
Yes, we should strive for continued openness. A decoupled world is a poorer world. If our incomes are lower, we'll not have the means to solve a lot of the other challenges that we are facing, such as climate change. So we should work for open and liberal trade regime.